One of the most frequent things I get asked about is what kind of additional tools and accessories I recommend for someone who's just gotten their first 3D printer. Or honestly, just in general, a lot of you are always asking me what tools I'm using in videos. So today I figured I would dedicate an entire video to it, going through what I think are the essentials and what I'd consider more upgrades to look at once you're a bit more established in the hobby. The really cool thing is a ton of these are 3D prints themselves, so you can start making them immediately after watching this video and customize them in whatever filament color you'd like. The first thing on my list tends to be the first print job on any new machine that I test out, and that is some sort of waste management, or as it's more commonly referred to in this hobby, a poop chute. Even if you're not multicolor printing, the majority of machines these days will start by creating a small bit of filament waste to essentially prime the nozzle before actually starting your print job, and the machine will fling that piece of waste in the general vicinity of the printer that you will probably want there to be something there, like a basket or box of some sort, to collect that waste so it's not just all over the place on your desk. This does get a little machine specific, so I can't just recommend one overall one. I will link below some of my favorites for my different machines, but there are a ton of options online for basically every 3D printer that creates this type of waste, so you can pick one that best suits your setup. I personally am a big fan of designs that involve some sort of separate chute and then waste bucket situation, since you do need to remove the waste at some point when it starts building up, and it having a removable basket instead of needing to remove like this entire giant whole chute situation is very handy. I know it's not the most exciting first 3D print to make, but it is definitely one of the more useful ones. Next on my list are toolboxes to house any of the tools and spare parts that come with the machine. It's one of those things that I just seem to have gotten in the habit of making for every 3D printer. A lot of the time the tools and spare parts will just be in like a cardboard box or a little baggie that is very easily lost. So having a dedicated organizer that you can label or multicolor print so that it's customized for that printer is just really handy. That way you know exactly where all of those tools are if you need to do any maintenance. And it also just ends up being a really fun print project. Yeah, I have a bunch of different styles of these. This one is clearly my Prusa XL one. This one's for my H2S. This giant one is for my H2D because it has all of the laser accessories in it as well. This is the one that I designed that has the actual bamboo wood inlays. In this box, I also have a couple of nozzle holders just. Some of those toolboxes do have spare nozzles in them, but for printers that use multiple nozzles or ones that I have like multiple sizes of, having a spare nozzle container is also really nice and handy. And you know, it just looks really nice to have them all laid out and organized like this. Another tool related print that I have is a scraper. Some 3D printers will come with its own scraper. Bamboo Lab machines all come with the blade and hardware needed to just print whichever handle that you would like. But this particular model is my personal favorite because it angles the blade in the way that you really don't have to be too concerned about accidentally scratching up your build plate. In general, a lot of the time you probably won't be needing to actually use a scraper, but there will always be one of those print jobs that just does not want to come off the plate cleanly, and you will need to bust out one of these. There are also ones that are fully 3D printable, so instead of having an actual sharp metal blade, it will be a plastic blade if you really don't want to run the risk of damaging your build plate. Yeah, a scraper is just always one of those things that's good to have on hand. Next is a bit more of an advanced 3D print, and that is this motorized filament loader. The majority of people probably not going to need this. It serves a very particular purpose, and in my case, I printed it specifically for my Prusa XL. The PTFE tubes on that thing are insanely long, and I just felt like I was spending hours standing beside it trying to manually load filament into each of the hot ends, and this thing makes it a whole lot faster. You just sort of clamp the filament in between those two extruder gears, and it will push it into whichever PTFE tube you need it to go into. So probably not a necessary print for the majority of people unless you just can't stand manually loading filament in yourself and want a faster way to do it, then highly recommend making one of these. It's really not difficult to wire up all the components, so a little more niche, but very useful nevertheless. Next on my list, I have AMS configuration. Everyone has their own unique setup, and thankfully there are a ton of available 3D prints out there to help you customize your machine to better suit whatever you're working with, whether that's needing to come up with a way way to attach multiple AMS units to a single machine and a way to stack those so it takes up less desk space, or even just having a single AMS unit taking up less space. One of my favorite prints I've done is the bracket you can print that reconfigures the AMS light so that it is completely vertical and taking up significantly less room. There's just a ton of options out there, whether you want things to be wall mounted or attached to IKEA SCADAS boards, or even if you want to fully enclose an AMS light. So highly recommend looking into some of those, because you might not realize that there could be a really good modification out there that would work so much better for your setup until you see it. In the same vein of printer setup and organization are filament racks. Again, there are a ton of awesome options available out there depending on how you want to store your filament, whether you want it to be a wall-mounted solution or something that you could just put on your desk. Most of them are also modular, which means you can customize it to fit your exact space, or, expand over time as your filament collection grows. Again, I will link some of my favorites below for you to check out that I'm currently using in my own setup, but again, please look online because there are a ton of awesome options out there. Speaking of filament clips are also a fantastic print to have on hand. It's also a great way to use up little bits of filament that you have left over. In general, I would highly encourage you to go on Printables or MakerWorld or any of the other 3D modeling websites and look up your machine and see what sort of 3D models and modifications there are for your printer. You will most likely find some really ingenious solution and accessories for your printer to make your setup all that much better. But now on to the non-3D printable stuff. The most necessary additions, I would say, would be anything to do with maintenance. The basic maintenance that the majority of 3D printers require these days is lubricating the various rails that they have. This is again one of those things that is a bit printer specific. Some of the machines will actually come with the lubricant that's recommended for the various rails. It tends to be different for the different rails as well. The Z rods use one type of lubricant and the linear rails use another. So do a search for your specific 3D printer so that you can figure out what lubricant is required for that machine, and you can pick some up to have on hand so that you're all good when maintenance time comes around. The next maintenance tool on my list is some sort of wire brush or scrubber to be able to help you clean the nozzle. Yes, the majority of 3D printers do perform some sort of nozzle maintenance and cleaning routine on their own these days, but there will inevitably be a time where it needs a little extra help. So having some sort of brush on hand will help you out in that endeavor. Some sort of wire brush like this can work great, but there are also a lot of 3D printable options available. This particular one uses a silicone scrubber that you just stick onto this printed handle. So it just sort of depends what you have on hand. If you already have the silicone scrubbers to make one of these, then 3D printable option is great. But if not, purchasing some sort of wire brush might be the better option for you. Another thing I'd recommend you having on hand is some isopropyl alcohol. It works great for wiping down beds and making sure they're clean and dust free so that 3D prints will stick to them appropriately. Eventually you might need to more thoroughly clean your build plate off with some warm water and degreasing dish soap, but in between those times and for just generally making sure that the build plate is clean, isopropyl alcohol is the way to go. Speaking of build plates and getting things to stick or not stick too much, we have some glue. Now there are products like these that are more specifically designed to be applied to build plates to either help prints stick better or to be an easy release for more difficult materials that maybe like sticking too much to build plates. The one thing that I will say in favor for this type of product is it is more of a thin liquid as opposed to the slightly chunkier glue stick. So these don't leave like pills of glue on the surface that might mess up your first layer. You can try and put this on really evenly and then just sort of like wipe it around to create more of an even finish across the entire build plate. But that also means that these are a thinner type of product than this. So if you are worried about using a material that does stick too well to a surface and you are applying these products for that easier release, then sometimes the glue stick is the peace of mind way to go, because these might not create enough of a barrier. Because at least for me right now, the majority of the time when I'm using those products, it is more for the release functionality rather than trying to get prints to stick to the build plates better. A slightly more specific tool that is also in the maintenance category is a PTFE tube cutter. This is another one of those things where there are 3D printable options available, but I've just been using the ones that have come with various lengths of of PTFE tube that I've bought over the years, because if you are needing to replace a PTFE tube and cut it down to the length that you need, you do really want to be using a tool like this, designed to not compress the PTFE tube when it's being cut the same way that you would find if you were using something just like scissors. Squished tube ends can create a whole bunch of problems for you later on, so you want to be using the right tool for the job. I have found that the majority of the time that I'm having to do any maintenance that involves unscrewing of various bolts, that I tend to grab the original tools that come with the machine. Sometimes those longer hex keys are the only ones that really can fit in the location that you need to reach, but this is the one exception, especially when doing any disassembling of hot ends. This is a really awesome little compact multi-mini screwdriver. It has just about every bit that you could possibly need or think of, and all of the bits get stored directly in the barrel of the screwdriver, which means if you're having to disassemble a hot end with different sizes of bolts, you only need to grab the one tool and you don't have to find multiple hex keys to do the job. It's also a lot more ergonomic and pleasant to use because you can kind of rest the end in your palm and then just spin the entire tool to either tighten or loosen the bolt using your thumb and first finger instead of having to wrench the entire hex key. So, also very handy if you're having to deal with tight spaces. This is also a screwdriver that I use a lot, not as much for printer maintenance, though I'm sure it's happened, but I know every time I use this in a video, I get a bunch of questions about it, so I just wanted to make sure I put it in this video to say this is what this thing is, and that is this Works electric screwdriver. It's a really nice sleek design that's comfortable to use. I do not have large hands, so having like a really massive chunky electric screwdriver is just not going to work for me. It just uses the standard magnetic bit size. It does come with quite a few bits, but I have added a couple of extra hex bit sets since that is what I'm using the majority of the time, whether that is for droid building or printer maintenance. This video is very FDM printer focused, but this is also the tool that I use to change my FEP sheets on my resin printers. So much less of a headache and faster when you use an electric screwdriver. Big fan of this thing for printer maintenance and just general assembly when you need an electric screwdriver. Another one of my must-have tools are side cutters. Some 3D printers will come with their own pair, but if not, it is a very inexpensive tool to pick up that's good for a lot of different purposes. This is generally what you would be looking at using if you need to trim your filament end, but it also can come in very handy for support removal. And so will these next tools. I'd highly recommend picking up a decent pair of needle nose pliers. These are the two ones that I've been using for years and have multiple pairs of at this point because I love them so much. This is a fairly standard pair, and then these ones are a lot smaller, which are excellent for getting into really tight areas to remove support material. The one thing I will say when looking for a pair of needle nose pliers is to make sure the points have some sort of grip or teeth. You can get ones that are completely smooth on the inside and they just really will not grab onto support material the same way that ones that have a little bit of texture built into them will. The other tool I use all of the time is a deburring tool. These are perfect for removing brims off of prints. The tip that's installed on mine is one that is specifically designed for plastic. It has a bit more of a precise tip to it that doesn't get in the way the same way that the more metal standard ones have. It just does a perfect job of cleaning up the edges for prints, and again, not a very expensive tool to look at adding. I do also occasionally use a craft knife both to remove brims and also to clean up some more tricky overhang areas. This kind is my personal favorite because it has a retracting blade, so I don't have to be worrying about an extra cap piece and having to put that on and probably like slicing myself up in the process. It's handy that you can put the blade away with one hand if your other hand is busy holding on to some giant 3D printed piece. And then of course the blades in this are equally as easily replaceable as they are for any other sort of craft knife of this type. In terms of other tools for finishing 3D prints, I would highly recommend picking up some super glue. It tends to be the easiest and best solution for assembling 3D prints. It's thinner than hot glue, so your finished pieces will fit together a lot better. You can also get it in a variety of precision tips, so you don't have to worry about making a mess with getting glue all over your printed parts. I don't really have one particular brand that I favor, and I have discovered over doing these videos for many years that apparently Canadian super glue is in a league all of its own, and by that I mean literally no one else can get it. So for the majority of you, it wouldn't be helpful if I was recommending specific super glues anyway. The last sort of print assembly recommendation that I have is looking at possibly picking up a set of asymmetric bolts. This is the one extra hardware piece that I see being used most frequently on prints. For instance, the majority of the toolboxes that I mentioned earlier use a few of these bolts for hinges. There's also various printer modifications that even if they end up using the same screw holes like on the machine, a lot of the time it will recommend that you use a longer bolt since you are adding a piece to that area. And you can get a pretty big multi-set that would probably cover you for quite a lot of different projects for not that expensive. For instance, this set has M2, 3, 4, and 5 bolts in 4 different lengths each. So this is one of those things where you might want to wait and see what types of print projects you might be interested in doing and what specific hardware they might use. But at some point you will possibly get so deep into 3D printing that you will end up with like 5 different sets of these to cover you for every possible project you could think of. Next on my list, I have a Wi-Fi security camera. A ton of printers these days have built-in cameras, especially if they're an enclosed machine. But if they don't and you want to be able to remotely monitor your machine, then a Wi-Fi security camera is a really easy pickup and setup to give you peace of mind and be able to have eyes on your printer regardless of where you might be in your house. Some printer companies create their own additional add-on camera, but a lot of the time the Wi-Fi security cams end up having better picture quality and also better night vision if you don't constantly have lights turned on in your workshop. I do still end up using these Wise cams on a couple of my machines, and they can also be helpful if you want to monitor multiple machines at the same time, just to make sure that everything is going okay, or even to see if your printer is finished printing. Not going to be necessary for everyone, but if you want to add some monitoring functionality to your setup, then this is a very easy way to do it. And of course, there's also a million different 3D prints to attach various security cameras to different machines. Now let's move on to some more fun printer accessories, starting with build plates, which, you know, here's yet another 3D printable organization option. The majority of 3D printers these days ship with a textured build plate, which is a great and versatile surface, but sometimes you might want a different option or something better suited for the job. There are a lot of 3D prints where the first layer that is stuck to the build plate is technically the top of the 3D print, and sometimes you might not want it to have that texture of a textured build plate. So you can get smoother finished build plates so that that surface has a nice smooth finish. You can see this particular smooth plate of mine is very well loved. There are also a bunch of different pattern plates for various machines that will leave a really cool surface on that first layer. Ones that leave like a starry pattern or things that look more like carbon fiber texture. You can get a lot of really cool effects and final looking prints with those plates. Something a little more functional that I've become increasingly more of a fan of are cool plates. So while the name cool plate is accurate in that you typically are looking at printing filament on these using a lower temperature than if you were using something like a textured build plate, but cool plates tend to have superior stickiness. And I don't mean that in a bad way, I mean it more in a you never have to worry about the first layer not sticking down flawlessly. As usual, there are quite a lot of options out there for cool plates. They also come in various degrees of tackiness depending on how much you want the print to stick to the build plate. So yeah, looking at getting different kinds of build plates for your machine is probably my most recommended accessory. The other thing would be looking at getting more nozzles or hot ends for your printer. It's one of those things that kind of falls between maintenance and more additional accessory. The nozzle or hot end is probably the most likely thing that you will need to replace at some point on your machine after it's been used for a long time, or if something happens to the nozzle. But there are also different sizes of nozzles as well as types of nozzles that you can get for printers. For instance, the standard nozzle on a lot of machines is made of brass, and if you were someone looking at getting into printing more abrasive materials, then you're going to want to swap that out for more of a hardened metal nozzle, because the filament will just chew through that brass nozzle like no tomorrow. But then of course you also have the option to pick up nozzles in various sizes. 0.4mm is the standard on most 3D printers, but you typically can get nozzles in 0.2, 0.6, and 0.8mm. So if you want your prints to have even more detail, you can go down to a 0.2mm nozzle. If you want to try and have your prints take even less time, then going up nozzle sizes can help with that. There are also some filaments that are recommended to use with larger nozzles only, since they are less likely to clog. I would say at the very least look at getting yourself a spare 0.4mm nozzle or whatever it is that's already installed on your machine. Sometimes it's more like an entire hot end assembly and not just the nozzle part, but just having a spare on hand so that if anything were to happen to the original, you know that you have an extra, you don't need to wait for an extra extra one to arrive and you can fix the printer right then and there is, you know, not the worst idea. Now, filament itself I didn't feel like was a tool or accessory in the context of this video, so I'm not going to be talking about any specifics there, but I do have some filament related accessories. Starting with this multi-kilogram spool holder. Multi-kilogram filament holders are again one of those things that technically there are 3D printable options for, but I have been a big fan of these metal Creality ones. These work great for 3 kilogram and 5 kilogram rolls. The one thing I will say though is that typically the spool holder itself rotates, like there are bearings within the tube, and between the weight of the spool and also if you have this on the desk beside a machine, the vibrations that the machine creates just unravel the spool way too much with the bearing in this. So I have a 3D printed brake on the side here that I would say is a pretty necessary accessory to this particular spool holder. So do keep that in mind if you decide to pick one of these up. I will link the print to that below as well. So yeah, if you're into using multi-kilogram rolls, highly recommend this one with that printed brake. Next are filament vacuum bags. If you weren't already aware, moisture is pretty detrimental for every type of 3D printer filament. To varying degrees depending on the type of material, some are more hygroscopic than others, but filament vacuum bags are a really easy way to reseal your filament rolls to keep them nice and dry. You technically can use any type of vacuum bag, but they do make more filament specific ones that tend to not be very expensive, and they are also in the perfect size for a filament roll, so you don't have this massive bag with an extra whole piece that's flapping around that you have to try and store. I've been using the Elegoo branded ones, I think, and you can also get the little USB rechargeable vacuum, which is super handy. But yeah, if you want a solution to keep your filament nice and dry that doesn't take up a whole lot of extra space, then filament vacuum bags are the way to go. If you don't mind having something taking up a little extra space, then these Polymaker poly dryers are super cool. So this is a very specifically designed filament size container that, yes, is airtight. It also comes with a humidity gauge and some desiccant that you can put in to keep this enclosure nice and dry, but you can also take these feet off from the container and sit this entire thing on the corresponding filament dryer, which for this pet CF I should probably do because 22% humidity is not great for this stuff. Yeah, this is just a really cool system that I only more recently found out. In general though, especially if you live in a more humid environment, having a filament dryer is probably going to be a necessary tool for you. Some of the AMS or multi-material systems have a filament dryer built into them now, but depending on what you're into 3D printing, some of them don't reach a high enough temperature that is technically recommended for some of the higher strength engineering filaments. I have a couple of Creality Pi space dryers is I believe what they're called. I have them in a couple of different sizes. That's another thing. You can get them in like 1 spool, 2 spool, 4 spool. I don't think anyone's gone above 4 spool yet, but I have noticed that those ones at least don't go up to as high of a temperature as something like the AMS HT from Bamboo Lab does. And it is also handy to have on hand at the very least to like refresh an open roll of filament if it's been out for a while. So the necessity of you needing a filament dryer is a bit environmental specific. Like, I am definitely not the filament drying expert. In fact, I'm pretty well known for being lax about filament drying. I don't know what it is about this workshop, but my humidity gauge always says dry. So I've just never had any issue storing my filament out in the open for years at a time and having it still print just as well as a brand new roll of material. I do clearly take more care for the more hygroscopic materials. So yeah, if you do live somewhere quite humid, then picking up a filament dryer is probably going to be a necessity for you, or at least having the ability to be able to dry out your filament rolls in some way, just to at the very least maintain them. The last thing I wanted to touch on is a bit more of a broad category, and that is printer furniture. Now, you don't necessarily need something that is specifically branded for 3D printing, but having a sturdy surface for the machine to sit on is vital. Even if placing the printer on a really shaky and unsturdy table doesn't affect your print job, it's probably not the best setup to have, so making sure you have a decently stable work surface for the machine to sit on, whether that be a desk or more of a workbench setup. There are quite a few DIY setups that people have made that are super cool, whether they involve 3D printed parts or are just more tutorials of how people made these different pieces of furniture to be more printer specific. I know BQ has more recently started coming out with more printer specific furniture, which is pretty cool to see. I believe there's also even filament storage that they make, but the printer carts that are newer look really cool. If my workshop was less established, I absolutely could see myself getting one, but I don't think I have a particularly good space for anything, at least at the moment. Something that I do have a couple of in my workshop that I'm a big fan of are these Mastercraft carts. I feel like they might be kind of Canada specific, but there could be very similar options out there. They're 2 feet by 3 feet, so more than enough space to fit a 3D printer. There's also a shelf, so you can technically fit another 3D printer underneath. And yeah, at this point I think I own 3 of them, and I kind of roll them around my workshop depending on what printers I need where and if I'm testing certain ones out. But it's just kind of like a mini workbench if you don't have the space to dedicate to a full workshop style workbench, but it's still a very sturdy piece of furniture if you were needing something like that. There are also the IKEA carts that I have a couple of that are perfect for filament storage. They're really inexpensive and fit filament just absolutely perfectly on them, and they also just happen to be the perfect height to fit under a standard workbench height. So if you are needing some inexpensive and quick filament storage, that's also a great option. And that's everything I have on my list. I would love to know what your must-have accessories and tools are, or if you have a favorite 3D print that you use all of the time or has made your setup even more user-friendly, please leave that below because I'm always looking for more recommendations. But that is everything, so thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.